intro. So Paul, I guess maybe you want to just kick things off?
Sure, I'll just say welcome to everybody, and thank you for joining this session. Global Fridays is at UNBC is very pleased to co-host this, and very grateful for the cooperation with CIC in putting this on. And we would normally be holding this on campus, but we are still on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territory of the Kwet'late, and we wish to acknowledge that at the beginning of our talk today, and look forward to hearing what Mark and John have to tell us today. So thank you, and over to you, Sean.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Paul. I guess first, before I make any introductions, I don't know if this is being recorded, but I believe you're normally recording all these Global Friday sessions. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just not sure if that's what's happening right now or not. So if
it
you
is
can
being
take a look
recorded.
at it. It is? Okay, awesome. All right, well, let me join in. So welcome everyone to today's talk. Today we're with Mark Williams, John Holmes, talking about Indonesia. My name is Sean Simmons. I'm president of the newly formed branch of Canadian-International Council here in Prince George. I'll be moderating today's talk with Mark and John. And let me just say how excited we are to have two experts on Indonesia speaking with us today. I just want to take a few seconds for a shameless plug about our newly formed branch here in Prince George. As with all organizations, we're on the lookout for Prince George residents who have a strong interest in international issues from a Canadian perspective. If you're one of those people, please go to the CIC.org and click Become a Member. I'll also post a link in the chat. A quick shout out to our directors here. In addition to myself, there's Nathan Andrews and Jacqueline Holler and John Kaysen, who have come together to form this local branch, and really appreciate their effort as we really start to introduce international issues to Prince George audience. And a special thanks to our partners at UNBC, the Global Friday Speakers Series, who we are co-hosting this event with. It's great to have an established partner with us to help build our branch. So the format of today's talk is as a speaker and a discussant. So that basically means first person will lead, Mark Williams from Vancouver Island U, as the speaker, and then John Holmes, the former ambassador to Indonesia, will follow as the discussant. After that, we hope to have both talks finished before 1, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. So let me start with a brief introduction about our speaker, Mark Williams. Dr. Mark Williams is chair of political studies at Vancouver Island University, where he joined the faculty in 2013. He is author of Indonesia, Islam, and International Political Economy, Clash or Cooperation. Mark has published articles and book chapters on topics such as the politics of Indonesia, Canadian foreign policy in the Asia Pacific, and international security issues. He's the editor of a forthcoming active learning textbook on the politics of the Asia Pacific with the University of Toronto Press. And Mark is also interested in the politics of sport and is the author of Mixed Martial Arts and the Quest for Legitimacy, the Sport versus Spectacle Divide. Mark, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you very much, Sean, and thank you, Paul. I'm very excited to be a part of Global Fridays at UNBC and to be a part of the speaker series for the CIC Prince George branch. My thanks to the president of the Victoria branch of the CIC, Dr. Chris Kilford, for reaching out to me about this event, and my thanks to John Holmes as well for being discussant. And I'm here in Nanaimo on the unceded traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation. And I'm going to bring up my short PowerPoint presentation. So I'm going to try to share screen, and hopefully someone will let me know if it's working or not before I get going. So can you all see the first slide of the PowerPoint presentation?
I can see it, Mark.
Okay.
Looks good.
Okay, great. So Indonesia, I'm going to talk a little bit about some notable features of Indonesia in just a few minutes, but this is an incredibly large country and an incredibly diverse country. It's said that if you were to take this archipelago of about 17,000 islands and transplant it to the Atlantic, it would stretch from the eastern coast of Newfoundland all the way to just about the western coast of Ireland. It contains about 300 different ethnic groups, about 700 different languages, and there is a 2,000-year-old civilizational history of the peoples who live in the archipelago, spanning Hindu, Buddhist, animist, and Islamic civilizations. It is the largest Islamic country in the world, and it's some variations of Islam that really aren't apparent in many other places around the world. Its dominant form of Sharia is Shafi'ah, and it includes groups of Muslims such as Abangan and Santry that we don't really hear too much about in places like the Middle East or in South Asia, which is more dominated by a Sunni-Shia divide. And what I'm going to really talk about are some of these emerging threats to Indonesia's democracy. And I'm not trying to suggest that Indonesia is, their democracy is threatened to completely collapse within the near future, but really to appreciate these fissures and these cleavages that are at play in Indonesia's political culture. And this is an incredibly large and diverse country. I really don't claim to be an expert of the country. I really see myself more of a student of its politics. And though I'm a Canadian who has lived in Indonesia on a couple of occasions, I'm really approaching my study of Indonesia's democracy from a place of good faith, where I really do wish the best for the country and for the people that live there. It's been noted that democracy seems to be under threat all around the world. In a recent report from Freedom House, A Leaderless Struggle for Democracy, it noted that there's been 14 years of democratic decline. It was 17 years ago when a public intellectual, Fareed Zakaria, published his book on illiberal democracy, noting that democracy seems to be taking on a number of authoritarian characteristics around the world, and that so many democracies seem to be one election away from its last election. The Democracy Index, which is this composite measure of various measurements of political rights and civil liberties published by The Economist magazine, commented in 2019 that year had the worst global average score for its democracy index since The Economist started producing it in 2006. And we can see some of the ways in which democracy is threatened all around us, such as through removal of term limits, erosion of the rule of law, attempts to undermine the public trust, attacks on freedom of expression in the press, and this growing intolerance. There's been quite a bit of literature as well that we've seen come out over the last couple of years on this erosion of democracy. A New York Times bestseller is the book How Democracies Die, written by a couple of comparative politics from Harvard University. And their argument, it's big and it's complex, but it really comes down to them for these two indicators: a growing intolerance in political culture and the decline of forbearance. Now, intolerance is a term that I think we can all appreciate, but maybe forbearance isn't necessarily one that is so obvious to all of us. And so forbearance means self-control. It means restraint. And the argument that they're making is that we've seen a decline in the restraint in politics. And so there is a lack of forbearance, so there is a lack of institutions and political leaders to hold back from attempting to impose policies on a society. And I think that these are two features that are really quite prominent in the case of Indonesia and the challenges to their democratic institutions. But I think that there are some other dynamics going on here that are worth thinking about. And another book that came out really quite recently through Princeton University Press on Hate in the Homeland, the New Global Far Right, this author really focuses on conspiracy theories and how prominent conspiracy theories are in the threat to democracy, like going all the way back to the 1930s with the rise of Nazi Germany and the National Socialist Party, and how it was that they used conspiracy theories and lies to gain political support, lies and conspiracies about the political leaders really abandoning a German military on the verge of winning World War I, and of course the hateful, racist lies about the so-called protocols of the Elders of Zion. And so conspiracism is really this profound challenge to democracies, and I think this applies to Indonesia as well. Indonesia is a middle-income country still, according to most indicators, such as that of the World Bank. And there's an argument that Dambisa Moyo didn't do the research on, but she made quite popular through her book Dead Aid and the number of TED Talks that she's done over the years, where she shows how literature, it suggests that democracy really only becomes impregnable when it has reached a GDP per capita of 6,000 US dollars per year. Indonesia's GDP per capita is around 3,900 US dollars per year. And the average lifespan of a democracy at that level of GDP per capita is about 30 years. Indonesia's been a democracy for about 22 years now. Here's some notable features about Indonesia. So it is the fourth largest country in the world, which some Canadians do find quite surprising. More Muslims live in Indonesia than in any other single country in the world. In fact, if you were to add up the sum of the number of Muslims living in Saudi, Qatar, the UAE, Oman, Yemen, Bahrain, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt, you would still come a little bit short of the number of Muslims living in Indonesia. Another interesting feature, though, of Indonesia is that it is one of the only members of the OIC, the Organization of the Islamic Conference, that does not actually have an Islamic constitution. In fact, for a number of years within the OIC, Indonesia was the only country in that group that did not have an Islamic constitution. It's a member of the G20, and I borrowed this figure from one of the ones that Sean put together for the promotion of this event, which shows that as of 2016, Indonesia became the 8th largest economy in the world based on purchasing price parity. And even if you were to just go with the nominal data for GDP, it would still rank as the 16th largest country in the world. But just 10 years from now, Indonesia will have the 5th largest economy in the world. And in 30 years, it'll have the 4th largest economy in the world based on purchasing price parity. It's also the 3rd largest democracy in the world. It underwent reformasi, or this reform, in 1998. And there was nothing inevitable about the events of 1997 and 1998 that would lead to an establishment of democracy and democratic institutions within Indonesia. Instead, this was a time when Indonesia became extremely dangerous. There was mass ethnic cleansing being carried out by the old Suharto regime in East Timor, and it looked like the authoritarian regime might in fact lash out in some very unpredictable, very dangerous ways. But this did not discourage regular Indonesians from taking to the streets of Jakarta and in major cities around the country, demanding an end to the new order and a new democratic beginning. And the military, for its part, it stood beside the protesters and forced the resignation of President Suharto. It was just a few years ago when Indonesia's democracy looked really good. In fact, just in 2015, it reached a score of just over 7 on the Economist Democracy Index. That put it in the upper tier of so-called flawed democracies, which is a tier that included countries like Japan and South Korea. The United States has been added to the upper tier of flawed democracies. And so things looked quite optimistic in a lot of ways about democracy being on the march within the country. As I noted though, this was not inevitable. There was chaos during the Reformasi era, even after 1998, when Suharto had resigned and it looked like Indonesia was on a path towards democratization. Well, there were a number of different presidents that were sworn in, 3 selected by the legislature before 2004, when Indonesia first had its direct election for president. And Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, or SBY, won that election in 2004. He won again in 2009. And that first term especially, and early in the second term, it was a very hopeful, very tolerant political culture that seemed to be sincerely dedicated to reform. SBY used to talk about Indonesia as a model democracy and a model for the rest of the Islamic world that would show how Islam's values are completely compatible with liberal democratic values of consultation, of consensus building, of negotiation, give and take, and the protections of fundamental freedoms. By the midway point of his second term in office, though, it really does seem like the mood in Indonesia begins to change, where the political culture seems to take on a less hopeful tone, less optimistic tone. And a lot of it had to do with SBY's rhetoric of anti-corruption, but his unwillingness to really treat it as seriously as most Indonesians thought he was treating it. So a number of anti-corruption institutions were created. They seem to be powerful. They seem to be taking on some major sources of corruption, like the Jakarta police force. But by that second term, the lack of any sincere efforts of anti-corruption were widely documented, and even SBY's own family became implicated in a number of corruption scandals. And by 2017, the Economist Democracy Index score for Indonesia dropped it back down to just around 6.5, which placed it just above the threshold to be considered a low-tier flawed democracy. So a tier of democracy that includes countries like India and Brazil. One thing I wanted to talk with you about this afternoon is that this is not Indonesia's first experience with democracy, which I think a lot of people might find surprising. Indonesia's history had been, during the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, characterized by devastating exploitation and hardship. It endured Dutch colonialism during this time, and then the invasion of the Empire of Japan during World War II, when Japan was creating its greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which brought just more misery and enslavement upon the Indonesian people. After Japan had surrendered, though, the Indonesian people were hopeful that they might be recognized as an independent state and a new member of the United Nations. However, the UN would not recognize an independent Indonesia in 1945, and the Dutch, with support from both the British and the Americans, attempted to reimpose its rule. And what occurs is a 4-year brutal war of independence, often referred to as the Indonesian National Revolution. And this was a chaotic war that really fractured the country. It wasn't just that the Indonesians were fighting against the Dutch and eventually they were victorious. Rather, it was this war of Indonesians against Indonesians. And so you had the center of the nationalist forces against the Dutch, but then you also had these other various factions too, including an Islamic faction, which wasn't supporting independence if it was not going to turn Indonesia into an Islamic country. And some of the notable militias fighting for those goals including Hezbollah. And so decades before Hezbollah was formed in southern Lebanon, there was a Hezbollah that fought in the Indonesian War of Independence to establish Sharia-governed part of Indonesia. Another one of these major organizations was called Dar al-Islam, which traditionally Dar al-Islam is translated as the abode of Islam, but within this Indonesian context, Dar al actually meant state. And so it was a group calling itself the Islamic State, decades before the Islamic State existed in Iraq and in Syria. So it was an incredibly divisive, fractured political culture, and there were Indonesians who in fact were siding with and fighting with the Dutch forces as well. And you might wonder why they might do that. Well, a lot of it revolved around this figure Sukarno. Sukarno became the leader of the nationalist movement during the War of Independence and rose to prominence as well in the 30s and the early part of the 1940s. But a great number of Indonesians really couldn't recognize Sukarno as a legitimate leader within the nationalist movement, primarily because he was a collaborator with the Japanese. And so there was still this significant number of Indonesians who were going to fight and die for the Dutch. Sukarno is one of the key people responsible for writing Indonesia's constitution, the Pancasila, along with some of his allies like Muhammad Hatta. And in this constitution that they write, they explicitly refrain from invoking Sharia or Islamic law. The closest that they get to with one of the principles of Pancasila is belief in one God. And so Sukarno wanted to have it vague like that to make sure that it appealed to Indonesia's substantial Christian minority groups as well. And although this was very, very alienating, as you can imagine, to other groups such as the Balinese, who believe in more than one God through their Hindu faith. And Sukarno, during the 1920s, he witnessed an Indonesian revival movement get crushed by the Dutch. And he thought that it was defeated because it became too fractured. The resistance to the Dutch became fractured, and it became too heavily radicalized by the communist groups within Indonesia. And he really started to talk about how Indonesia it needed to be based on 3 major pillars of political culture that he called Nazakam. So nationalism and agama, which means religion. So he meant religion in this broad ecumenical sense of it. And then communisme, or communism. And so he saw that these were the 3 pillars of Indonesian society, and that an independent Indonesia needs to be based on all 3 of these. Even their foreign policy doctrine at the time of the revolution and in the aftermath, called Bebas dan Aktif, which meant independent or free and active, was based on recognizing that Indonesia would never be governed by any one of those factions. The parliamentary democracy that was created after Indonesia was finally recognized by the Dutch and the Americans and the UN itself was a very pluralistic type of system. At first, you had people appointed from all the various parties to the parliament, and eventually a broader election to decide the makeup of the parliament. And the largest party within it was an Islamic party known as Masyumi. And the leader of Masyumi for a time, an Islamic scholar by the name of Muhammad Natsir, he really began to write in the 1940s and the 1950s about these fears that he had of the erosion of asabiya. It's an Arabic term invoking kinship and a social unity. He became deathly afraid that this was waning. And in the 1960s, Sukarno, also seeing the decline of national unity, really went on the offensive against Masyumi, or against the bloc of Nasacom called Agama, so the religious parties within Indonesian society, that even though Sukarno was an Abangan Muslim, he was never really comfortable with people like Natsir and Masyumi. He actually abolished Masyumi and prevented them from being a part of the parliament, and he eventually puts the whole parliament on ice and announces a new guided democracy and a guided economy. His foreign policy becomes one based on what he calls confrontasi, and as you can imagine, that means confrontation and living dangerously. He pulls Indonesia out of the United Nations, out of the Bretton Woods economic system, so out of the International Monetary Fund. He tells the United States to go to hell with its aid. And when Indonesia suffers some really crushing inflation, there is this coup and then a counter coup where Sukarno eventually is removed from power. The military closes in onto Jakarta, and eventually a new President Suharto takes control of the country and rules as an authoritarian leader for 30 years. And during the coup and counter coup in the 5 to 6 month aftermath, about 1.5 million Indonesians are killed in some of the most horrible ways you can possibly imagine. So parliamentary democracy died a truly tragic and brutal death. There's now, more recently, if we flash to contemporary Indonesia, there was an event from just a couple of years ago where the governor of Jakarta was actually arrested and served jail time. And yes, this is an image from a comic book. It's one of the things that I like to do is to look at how political culture can be expressed through various art forms. And there was a case where an young Indonesian artist was actually got a contract to be an artist for X-Men comics, so one of the flagship comics for Marvel. And what he did in his very first issue was to have some anti-Christian, anti-Jewish messaging hidden in the comic book. And it was so well hidden that it wasn't actually known until it was an Indonesian reader who picked up on it, and then through Facebook started to explain to Marvel why what this guy was doing was actually really offensive, and some other Indonesians also piped into social media to vouch for it. And it has to do with the numbers that he scattered all throughout it, the number 212 and the number 51. And eventually this young man, he threw away a promising career to have this pretty hateful messaging. And it has to do with the governor of Jakarta, Ahok, as he was most commonly known. And he was giving a speech to residents in Jakarta's Thousands Islands district. And it was here where he was accused of violating Indonesia's blasphemy laws. And he was allegedly blaspheming against Islam, saying that Islam and the Quran was lying to Muslims. And it was the Islamic Defenders Front, so-called FPI, and another group that made these police reports where the North Jakarta District Court found him guilty of blasphemy. And what he said during this speech is right there for you to take a look at. And the verse, it's from chapter 5 of the Quran, verse 51. It's why this Indonesian artist puts 51 in here. And he has 212 because this is a code phrase for December 21st, which is when these protests against the governor of Jakarta were being held. It was known as a 212 movement. And what happened, though, is that the video was edited by a university professor, then re-uploaded to make it sound as if Ahok was saying that the Quran was lying to people, lying to Muslims. And there was even an appeal. So Ahok tried to appeal it to Indonesia's Supreme Court, and they rejected the appeal. Even though it was based, the original court case was based on doctored video evidence. Ahok was also regarded as this double minority because not only is he not Muslim, he's actually Christian, but he's also a member of Indonesia's significant Chinese minority. And it's really in the 2014 and 2019 elections where things start to heat up and the fissures in Indonesia's democracy really become quite notable. These are elections contested by Jokowi, who wins in 2014 and won again just recently in 2019 against Prabowo. And these were contests between two political opposites. Jokowi is this humble, modest, policy-driven political leader basing his appeals on his work in infrastructure development. Now, Prabowo is really the opposite. He's bombastic. He is this a populist in the fullest sense of the word. Prabowo's history is incredibly controversial. He became the commander of the so-called Army Strategic Reserve Command, and this was the same division that Suharto was the commander of back during the days of the coup and counter-coup that ousted Sukarno from power. In 1998, when the Strategic Reserve Command came into Jakarta, Prabowo allegedly ordered his soldiers to kidnap and torture anti-Suharto activists. Prabowo was called to the presidential palace, where he came with truckloads full of soldiers loyal to him, and came into the palace. Apparently, he confronted B.J. Habibie, Suharto's vice president, and who was about to become the next president of Indonesia. And it really only diffused when Suharto interjected and largely told Prabowo to just step down and to step back from this. He was dishonorably discharged from the military. He lived briefly in exile in Jordan until he learned it was safe to come back to Indonesia. And he had been denied visa entrances to the United States since at least the year 2000. However, as Indonesia's current Secretary of Defense, what's really quite bizarre is that he just spent a few days in Washington meeting with his American counterpart, Mark Esper, as a member of the Trump administration. So for some reason, the Trump administration in late October invited Prabowo to Washington for a few days, where it seems as if he had no trouble being admitted into the country under the Trump administration. So Jokowi wins these elections, but he wins them really quite narrowly. Prabowo called the elections fraudulent and had ironically been denouncing a corrupt elite. And I say ironically because unlike Jokowi, Prabowo is an extraordinarily rich individual. Prabowo calls Indonesia a basket case and laughingstock to the rest of the world in his speeches, which I think echoes a certain other president that you might be thinking about. His brand of politics is intense nationalism. It's denouncing other countries. It's denouncing international organizations. It's denouncing the norms of diplomacy. And he's often pandering to radical Islamist sentiments, such as in 2019, during the first presidential debate, he started saying how terrorism in Indonesia is done by foreigners, and it's from people who are from slums, basically, both of which has long been established since the Bali bombings of 2002 to not really be the case, that these terrorist groups within Indonesia actually have surprisingly little connections with terrorist groups in other places of the world, and that there is a surprisingly high percentage of terrorists involved in groups like Jemaat Islamiyah who come from pretty middle-class backgrounds. In a story written up by a journalist in The Guardian, the journalist tells Prabowo, just railing against him, shouting, "Don't come and teach me democracy, don't teach me politics of identity, I know." And the journalist even confides to the reader that he really felt like Prabowo was going to have him killed on the spot. He felt like they were in a plane together, and he thought that it was entirely possible that Prabowo was going to have him thrown out of the plane. So in May, Jokowi was declared the winner. He won by a much narrower victory than was originally anticipated. Riots broke out in Jakarta due to these rampant allegations of voter fraud, which Prabowo had been stoking for the previous 5 years. A number of people close to Prabowo were arrested for treason and for moving weapons during these riots that got fairly violent at it. Prabowo, as I mentioned, was appointed defense minister by Jokowi, and the military views of Prabowo seem to be conflicted, whereas some in the military do feel a strong allegiance to Prabowo. That said not to be universal, that a lot of the senior military people really think that Prabowo has done much to tarnish the credibility of the military in modern Indonesia. Indonesia's government even shut down social media sites once the riots really became quite violent, such as WhatsApp and Facebook, because of the disinformation campaigns that were found in them, such as claiming that Chinese soldiers were actually being used as riot police. So it wasn't even Indonesians working as riot police, which was proven to not be the case. And there were all these reports of how police were massacring Muslims inside of mosques, despite all the evidence being to the contrary. And there is this growing tide of conservative Islamic activism coming up in Indonesia over the last few years. One of the most prominent groups is the so-called Islamic Defenders Front, or the FPI, which was formerly a really violent group. They supposedly denounced violence in order to go into the mainstream, and their mainstream politics, though, is really an incredibly intolerant vision for Indonesia. And there's some paradoxes, too, of democracy in Indonesia, and I'm going to wrap things up here. And one of those major paradoxes is that as Indonesia has seen its democracy strengthen and solidify, it really brought about this counterproductive force of creating a political culture of intolerance. So when Indonesia first became a democracy, those parties that were giving a very angry, populous, and intolerant vision of the country, they did really, really poorly. Like, they weren't winning seats in the People's Consultative Assembly. But now it seems as if their strength has grown quite a bit. So I think that I'll stop it here. We can chat about why this matters to Canada with Canada's former ambassador to Indonesia, John Holmes, or we can also talk about this during a Q&A session. So I'm going to stop share screen and turn it over to John as soon as I can figure out how to do that. Okay. Okay, I think I got it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. What an excellent overview of Indonesia. And it's interesting, your comments about Prabowo as formerly a rival and now in defense minister, reminds me of the team of rivals of Doris Kearns Goodwin of Lincoln's administration. So that's interesting that he brings the enemy right into his camp. So it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. But anyways, thank you very much. That was really enlightening. What we'll do now is move into the discussant session, where basically John Holmes will act as the discussant. It's a new term I just discovered. It's considered the final speaker in a symposium who highlights and integrates contributions of various speakers. John Holmes worked as a civil servant for 39 years, with much of his career spent with Global Affairs Canada. Until 2019, Holmes served as Canada's ambassador to Philippines, having taken up his assignment in September 2016. Prior to the Philippines, Holmes served as Canadian ambassador to Turkey from 2012 to 2016, ambassador to Indonesia from 2006 to 2009, and ambassador to Jordan from 2003 to 2006. Holmes also served as non-resident ambassador to Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkmenistan, Timor-Leste, and Iraq. And in 2009, Holmes was appointed Canada's first representative to the Association of Southeast Asia Nations. John, great pleasure to have you here. I'll pass it off to you.
Thanks very much, Sean, and thanks to Mark for his great introduction and covering a lot of ground that I think a lot of people are interested. Shout out to a couple of colleagues, Chris Kilford, who also roped me into this session as well, Mark. So great to reconnect with Chris, who worked with me in Turkey. And a couple of former ambassadors are on the program too. Ken McCartney, who knows Southeast Asia well, but was our last position was our ambassador in Sweden, and Jan Top Christensen, who is the Danish ambassador in the Philippines, who's on the line, I think, and is moved to Canada. So our active immigration program in the Philippines worked very well. We snagged a former Danish ambassador. Mark has done, I think, a great job of doing an introduction and also touching on many of the themes about the threat to democracy in Indonesia. I just want to cover a few points, maybe augment a little bit of what Mark touched on. Then I want to talk a little bit about Canada-Indonesian relations, and then just finish up, just to open up that area of discussion, talk a little bit about the broader question of Canada and ASEAN, and talk a little bit maybe about the RCEP, which I'll come back to. And I'll try to do it pretty quickly, so we still have half an hour or so for questions and answers. And as I said, Mark really did a great job in terms of the introduction. And one of the things that I really enjoyed with his presentation was the focus on the history. And I can't overemphasize enough how important history and the evolution of democracy and the challenges to democracy in Indonesia continue to play a key role in what's happening. Certainly what was happening a few years back, 10 years ago when I was in Indonesia, but I know from talking to colleagues is certainly continues to be relevant. And one of the things that Mark mentioned was the importance of Pancasila, which is the guiding philosophy of Indonesia. It was elaborated not only by Sukarno, but also colleagues like Hatta and others, the founding members. And it's interesting to see Pancasila still referred to even in modern times. And recently, President Jokowi mentioned it, and I think there were even statements by key members of the military, the TNI, talking about their role as defending the principles. Very quickly, the five principles are nationalism, humanity, which is a broader concept. It's kind of internationalism, Indonesia's place in the world, democracy, and I'll come back to that, social justice and belief in one supreme being. And as Mark mentioned, not just Allah, but also other beings that minorities in Indonesia believe in. And I just want to stress a few things. Despite Mark's very accurate analysis that democracy is under threat, and there have been some challenges to Indonesian democracy in the last couple of years. I mean, we shouldn't underemphasize, and I don't think Mark was intending to do that, what Indonesia has achieved in terms of its democracy is quite incredible. And Mark touched on the diversity of the country, the geographic challenges, and in fact, in a few days, unless it's postponed, in a few days, Indonesia is organizing a series of elections for the regional and government level, which is truly, if you think the Americans had a tough time organizing their election, you can imagine how difficult it is in Indonesia in that context. And yet they're still able to do it. They are able to do it with relatively little violence. And unlike some other major democracies, they actually are able to declare a winner. And the opponent ultimately accepts the result. And I think this is one of the strengths of Indonesia's democracy. I think the elections at the regional level are also, although the jury remains out, very important, because the whole concept, which was rolled out when I was in Indonesia 10 years ago, is the concept of devolution of power, bring power and governance to a more local level. And as Mark said, you've got a huge, massive country, 250 million plus people. The idea was to devolve power to the more regional levels. I think the jury is still out on how successful that is, but I think it's an important project in furthering Indonesian democracy. There are, though, and I think Mark has flagged some of these, quite a few challenges, threats, if you will, to democracy in Indonesia. There is a lack of strong democratic institutions and respect for the rule of law. I think the judiciary lacks independence and is susceptible to political influence. Mark gave the example of the Ahok case. We Canadians have the example of the school teacher whose case was basically the decision to find him guilty and increase the sentence that he had was done by political influence, influencing the upper levels of the Indonesian judiciary. So it remains, I think, a concern. Political parties are weak. It's dominated still by political dynasties, although there is scope for people to come forward. Jokowi is an example. He built his base in Jakarta as the governor, but still the dynasties and strong individuals remain. Political allegiances are pretty fluid, and I think the best recent example is Prabowo ending up being Minister of Defense. But many other examples of people shifting allegiances over what kind of offers, we don't know. But I did want to make one reference to history, and that is going back to the 5 principles of Pancasila, the importance of consensus. And in an era where we see competing parties, winner take all, I think it's still prevalent, the thinking of many Indonesian political leaders, and I think it's the case with Jokowi, the need to contest and have elections, but after that try to pull as many people back into the tent. And I think that was very much the idea behind it, not to mention the idea of neutralizing a very powerful and potentially dangerous colleague. One point, maybe you mentioned it, Mark, I'm not sure. How did Prabowo become so powerful initially? He was the son-in-law of Suharto, And I think that really led to him getting those positions, senior positions in the military early on. Police, you mentioned corruption, and I heartily agree that is still a major problem, and presidents get elected on anti-corruption agendas. It's so pervasive, it's still a problem. It was certainly a problem during the SBY years, remains a problem now. Unfortunately, one of the most corrupt institutions are the police. I think has a better reputation, and I think is less involved in corruption. I always remember when I was talking to an anti-terrorism expert from another country about Indonesia's strategy and abilities to tackle terrorism, and he told me that one of the biggest challenges was getting the police to recruit really good police officers into the anti-terrorism unit. Now, in North America and Europe, that's one of the key roles within police. You'd think every young graduate would want to end up there. Well, no, in Indonesia, they want to be traffic cops because that's much more lucrative than working in the anti-terrorism field. You mentioned radical Islam. There is ISIS units in Indonesia still. They have a problem with the prisons. They've actually got a fairly good anti-terrorism unit, Detachment 88, and they have had good progress, not only in capturing Islamic terrorists, but also killing some of the key bomb makers for the bombs that happened, the attacks that happened from 2001 on. But radicalization continues to happen in the prisons, for example, and is happening still outside. And you see it in terms of not only terrorism, but you see it in terms of attacks on minorities, not only Christians, but Ahmadiyya and other minority groups in Indonesia. A few words on Canada. You mentioned the importance of Indonesia, Mark. Of course, G20 partner, moderate Islamic democratic country, so a model for Islamic democracy in other parts of the Islamic world. We have a long relationship, I think 70 plus years with Indonesia. We've had active aid programs in the country, primarily in the island and the region of Sulawesi, but programs that benefited others. Of course, humanitarian relief is a key priority and has been for Canada. We were there in the aftermath of the 2005 tsunami. And we had a massive program, thanks not only to the government of Canada, but to the people of Canada who contributed enormously to the relief program there. But one thing, and I'll be frank here because I'm no longer in government, we have not taken Indonesia seriously enough. And I post-pandemic, hopefully things will change, but I'm not optimistic. To have a strong and comprehensive relationship with any strategic partner like Indonesia, you have to invest in it. And it's not just money. You have to invest time and effort. Leaders have to get together. Ministers have to get together with their counterparts. And we haven't really done that well. Of course, going way back to the Suharto years, the Suharto's hands were covered in all kinds of blood, from East Timor to human rights abuses within Indonesia proper. And it was difficult. Everyone probably, maybe not your students, but everybody remembers Suharto's trip to Canada for APEC and the demonstrators who were gassed, pepper sprayed by the police. But from 2006 to 2009, that's 3 years that I was there, not one Canadian minister came to Indonesia on a bilateral visit. We had a couple who came for international meetings, for example, on climate change, but no bilateral visits. You can't run a relationship with a major G20 partner, if you act unless you take the time to invest. And of course, and I understand why. We can maybe talk about this during the Q&A, but we also have a habit, if you will, of letting individual cases define the whole relationship with a country. And it's not just Indonesia. We could talk about other examples, but certainly in the case of Indonesia, you had a Canadian citizen who was badly treated, who was, railroaded by the judicial system, but that consular case came to define the whole relationship. So all ministerial contacts were essentially stopped. Certainly there were no visits, and it had an impact on the relationship. Looking forward, I think, now that the case is resolved, I'm hoping, and after, post-pandemic, that we will see, changes to the relationship. And it's not only the importance of Indonesia per se. We have significant trade interests and political interests. I think the wheat sales to Indonesia are going through the roof, and many other agri-food products, et cetera, et cetera. We can talk about that, but also Indonesia's importance, influence within ASEAN. It is the largest country in ASEAN. It's an important player. Of course, the secretariat, the headquarters of ASEAN is based in Jakarta, and it's extremely important to have a good relationship with Indonesia if we, Canada, have ambitions in our relationship with ASEAN, and we do. And we were invited for the very first time to participate at the the main ASEAN meeting in Manila, and Prime Minister was Trudeau. Trudeau was invited to participate. First time that a leader was invited to participate at the ASEAN Plus meeting, and we have ambitions to join that group, but it's a challenge, and the importance of having Indonesia on board cannot be underestimated. I won't talk too much now because my time is running out, but we've all probably seen in the news that this new China-led ASEAN Agreement, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, has just been adopted. This is a competitor to the Canadian participation in CPTPP, and that is going to have certainly an impact. And although Indonesia is not part of CPTPP, it remains an important economic player within ASEAN. So where does Canada go from here in the face of RCEP, which we're not part of? Well, hopefully we can continue to expand ratifications within the CPTPP, but also we have initiated talks, exploratory talks with ASEAN for a free trade agreement, and we were told wait till RCEP is done and then we'll talk. So now that that is over, and presumably after the pandemic, we may be able to relaunch with ASEAN, but there will be questions because frankly RCEP is not a very good international trade agreement. There are no standards on the environment, there are no standards on labor, it doesn't advance intellectual property protection one bit. So really we have to ask ourselves if that's the model that ASEAN wants to engage with Canada, is it worth it, or are they willing to negotiate on a more modern FTA, which I believe is the position of the Canadian government, one that would include environmental and other standards. So I'm going to leave it there. There's still a lot of scope for, I hope, questions, and Mark and I can elaborate a little bit more on some of those issues. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you very much, John. Very informative. I really appreciate you putting Canada's perspective, both in terms of the challenges that we face, as well as some opportunities for us, and bringing up the RCEP. At this point, what I want to do is just point out that this is one of a series of talks that's being put on by CIC branches. I posted a few other upcoming talks, and these have all been coordinated by Chris Kilford. You'll have heard his name mentioned a few times. Chris has done an amazing job helping set up these talks across the country, and just want to say a special thanks to Chris for that. In terms of sort of the next step, essentially we're going to jump into Q&A, and I'm going to pass this off to Jacqueline Haller, and she'll be managing the question and answers. And anyone that has a question, please type in your question into the chat box on the right-hand side.
Great. Thank you, Sean. We've already got one question popping up, so I just encourage everybody to just drop those into the chat, and we'll go through them one by one. The first question comes from Carissa, and the question is, as an Indonesian, I'm curious, how do you think Islam impacted or is going to impact Indonesia's democracy? Is religion part of the threat to democracy in Indonesia?
I'd like to comment on that. What I find really quite striking is that traditionally, Islam has actually been a major source of support for democracy in Indonesia. That it was really, for instance, during the parliamentary democracy, Masyumi, the Islamic party that was most heavily represented in that parliament, they were really the most moderate force there. That they weren't like the nationalists, and they certainly weren't like the communists. Instead, they were the ones that really seemed to be representing the strongest liberal values of any of the other major groups. And they were the ones that seemed to be defending liberalism and democracy against the communists, for instance. And the role of communism in Indonesia during the 1920s up to the 1960s was really, really strong. It said that the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI, had actually become the largest communist party in the entire world outside of communist countries. So it was really quite strong. I would also say that this is also true for most of the Reformasi period as well. It seems like for most of the mainstream parties that they really did try to connect with Islamic values and Islamic norms as well, and that for most of the Reformasi period, it really did look like there was this natural cohesion between the largest and most influential Islamic parties, but also Islamic societies as well. Like the biggest one in Indonesia is called NU, Nahdlatul Ulama, and they've been one of the strongest sources of support for Reformasi and the democratic institutions of Indonesia. And it's really just within, I would say it's within the last few years where you've really seen a growing tide of a more conservative expression of Islam that really wants to challenge the status quo in some pretty powerful ways. That they don't really accept the Constitution, like they really don't accept the generally secular nature of it, and have started to try to apply pressure through groups like the People's Consultative Assembly to pass laws that cater to this growing views. There's actually an edited book that just came out a couple of months ago on this growing conservatism within Islam. One of the editors is a friend of mine from Singapore called Leonard Sebastian. And it's really effective at showing how there is a certain growing threat. But I would say that historically, Islam has really been a pillar of support for democracy, both in the past as well as in the present age. It's just that there's this current trend that seems to be challenging the old norms.
I would agree with Mark's comments, and just to add a couple of things. I mean, there is a strong current out there that believes that Islam and democracy are incompatible, and I do not share that view. And I think Indonesia is, even with its deficiencies and challenges, is a good example of how Islam can function. And as Mark said, often it was Islamic parties that were defending democracy in Indonesia. But Islam, like any other religion, any other ideology, can be misused by people, and I think that's unfortunately what has happened by some, some actors within Indonesia and elsewhere. And you see it in terms of people willing to use violence against others, whether it's other minorities, religious minorities, or even among other Muslims who they believe are not complying with the right kind of Islam. And also, I think, that Mark mentioned the earlier, and I wanted to touch on that, and I hadn't in my presentation, increasing polarization, which we see throughout the world, and it's happening in Indonesia. And the kinds of misuse of Islam that we're seeing in the AHA case and in other examples didn't really see, 12 years ago when I was in Indonesia, even though they had they had ISIS type terrorism. But that kind of misuse of of religion to attack political foes, that's a disturbing new trend.
Thank you both. The next question is from Chris Kilford, who thanks you for your kind words. Thanks everyone for the kind words, I suppose, since you've all mentioned him, and asks, how is the relationship with China? Are factories and jobs shifting to Indonesia from China?
Well, I would say that during the last decade or so of the Suharto years, Indonesia really had some tremendous growth, and a lot of that growth did come through this manufacturing sector. I don't think it's really because of Suharto, but rather because the oil decreased in value, quite dramatically during the 1980s, and so he wasn't as effective at just overseeing a rentier state like he had been in the past, and so he gave more influence to the technocrats again, who really were the driving force for these reforms to help establish major manufacturing centers in places like Jakarta and elsewhere. So Indonesia was industrializing quite heavily in the 1990s, but it's after the Asian financial crisis, and really after China accedes to the WTO, you really have a deindustrialization happen within Indonesia that lasted for quite a bit of time, really about 10, 15 years. And it's just recently where you've seen these efforts to reindustrialize within Indonesia due to really a lot of I think it's a combination of things. I think it has to do partly with the higher costs involved with Chinese labor relative to other places of production in Southeast Asia now, like places like Vietnam, but also Indonesia to a lesser extent. But it also has to do with these fears surrounding China's place in a globalized world order, and whether products are going to that are coming from China are going to be subjected to pretty high price tariffs. And so even though China has an incredible amount of foreign direct investment coming out of it into Southeast Asia, it's still not as much as Japan, for instance. And so like Japanese foreign direct investment is still pretty a decisive force when it comes to the manufacturing based in the region. And you're seeing, I think, more Japanese firms that are really uncomfortable with the rise of China in a lot of ways, uncomfortable with this dependency they seem to have with China. And there seems to have been, at least during the final stages of Abe's time as prime minister, a lot of financing to encourage Japanese foreign direct investment out of China and into places like Southeast Asia, such as Indonesia. So I do think that there is this strong possibility that Indonesia will regain a lot of those manufacturing strength that it had during the 1990s. And I think that Indonesia is also fairly uncomfortable too with a growing China. That Jokowi is having a very careful relationship with China. China's Belt and Road investment has come into Indonesia in certain places, like a high rail line in between Jakarta and Bandung. So he is trying to manage a relationship, but he is certainly careful not to be antagonistic, but also not to be seen as being too cozy with Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party. The last time a president of Indonesia was really, really close to China and acting as if they were, brothers to the Indonesians was actually Sukarno at the end of his time in power. And, that was, even back then in the 1960s, that was extremely alienating and deeply concerning for most Indonesians, and Jokowi has to be careful not to do that now. Bo is definitely antagonistic towards the Chinese-Indonesian relationship, and a lot of his rhetoric has really denounced China and has suggested that Jokowi is making Indonesia into like a puppet of China. And so that is a rhetoric that can be used against Jokowi quite disastrously.
Good. John, you're good? Good. All right, we'll move on then. We have 3 more substantial questions on the board. Gerald asks, as Indonesia grows economically, do you think that it will play a bigger role in global issues? Indonesia has not been too ambitious a global power until now.
Maybe I'll start, Mark. Yeah, that is a question that we've been asking, I think, for quite a few years, perhaps since 2000, after Reformasi and the evolution of Indonesian democracy. And I think going back, it was one of the, I think, major disappointments of the SBY era. Not only the lack of effort on anti-corruption, but also I think people expected Indonesia to kind of take a more substantial role internationally, and they did on a few issues, but really they did not step up. And I think there's a whole range of issues as to why that is the case. Of course, just managing the country, both economically, politically, is a huge challenge for any administration in Indonesia. And also, in terms of leadership, we in the West, certainly in Canada, we saw Indonesia as a should be stepping up in terms of it as a model, as a democratic model, that it can incorporate the being a strong Muslim country, and yet it can foster and develop a strong democracy. But it didn't really, it wasn't comfortable with that role, and certainly the kind of Islam that is practiced by the vast majority of Indonesians, in the Middle East, they don't see that as a model. I think also I wanted to mention just quickly that Indonesia has always had a problem dealing with its own history, and I think this has an impact on not only what's happening nationally, but also internationally. And they've not come to terms with what happened in 1967. They have not come to terms with the crushing of Darul Islam in the 1950s. And although they have patched things up with Timor-Leste, they have a joint Truth and Reconciliation Commission that worked for a number of years. The leaders of Timor-Leste are good friends with the leaders of Indonesia, but they haven't really addressed what happened and why. And I think, and then we haven't even talked about Papua, and that whole situation, or Aceh. So I think a lot of those kind of domestic issues have an impact on its ability to act internationally.
Yeah, I agree with John. I think he's absolutely right about with that commentary that Indonesia has been a little bit reluctant to have too strong of a international profile. There was a story that Yudhoyono SBY told this one interviewer about how Barack Obama had talked to SBY about the idea of him doing his A New Beginning speech from Jakarta. So that was the speech from the first year of Obama's time in office about a new beginning of American relations with the Islamic world. And so he wanted to do it from Indonesia because he spent a few of his childhood years there, and he thought that it would resonate well from Jakarta as this place of Islamic democracy. And Yudhoyono supposedly told the Obama administration people not to do that, that it wasn't really a good idea. The Indonesian-American relationship is so strong, it's so stable, and it would just have a higher profile coming from somewhere in the Middle East, so Cairo, which is where they did it. And it supposedly, Yudhoyono wasn't really comfortable with that kind of a profile for Indonesia.
Interesting, thank you. Paul says, thanks for an interesting discussion. When we think of authoritarianism and populism in the region, we often think of Duterte in the Philippines. How would you compare the political dynamics in Indonesia and the Philippines?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about the Philippines. I think that question probably comes from my colleague Yantop. He probably knows more about he can give a better answer than I can. But the differences between the two, I think I mean, there's many similarities. Let's start there. I mean, both are democracies, but both have flaws. Both, as I mentioned earlier, characterized by weak democratic institutions. The elections run well, and you get a clear result in the elections, but rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, other facets of Parliament, Congress in the Philippines, there are definitely challenges there. I think another similarity, but there are differences, is the importance of the strong man. I think, in Philippines, you had Marcos for many years at the same time that you had Suharto. And now you have Duterte, who fashions himself as a strong man, ready to stand up to the nasty Americans, and you had the same kind of character, Prabowo, in Indonesia, but fortunately he didn't win, and you had a more consensus-building, traditional kind of Indonesian leader in Jokowi who won. So I think those are some of the similarities and differences. Mark?
Yeah, I think so too. I think that the similarities really persist between Duterte and Prabowo, that those two really do seem to share similar style, and I think a lot of the same kind of rhetoric too, like especially when it comes to when talking about the West, right? With Duterte, we've seen a lot of some pretty fiery anti-Western kind of commentary coming from him, and Prabowo has done that as well. Like, there's been some stuff, like in that one little story from the journalist that I mentioned about how the journalist thought that he might get thrown out of this plane. He also recorded Prabowo as he was ranting about how he's not afraid of white people in terms of he wasn't going to sit here and listen to any kind of tough questions from this one reporter from a British newspaper, for instance. And so you also had that anti-Western sentiment coming through. But I guess the key difference is that Jokowi held on to a victory, and it was close though, like, especially in 2019. There were some polls that were suggesting that Jokowi was going to win by like 20 points, and it was anything but that. Like, it was pretty narrow, and I even have a friend who was doing ethnographic research leading up to the election, and based on his time interviewing people in Western Java, he thought that Prabowo was going to win this. Like, he thought that the mood was there and that the sentiment was there. Another interesting connection between the Philippines and Indonesia is that radical Islamist insurgency does have some connections between the countries. And so most scholarship talks about how Indonesian terrorist organizations, they have very little contact, like less contact than you would think with places like in South Asia or the Middle East. But the one country where there is some connections is with the Philippines. And so you do have the major Indonesian terrorist organization, Jemaat Islamiyah, that the one country that they do have a base of operations in is in the Philippines. And so there has been coordinated actions between the Philippine military and the Indonesian military to try to attack JI in Philippines, in the Philippines itself. So that's where there's another one of those connections too. I think that Duterte and Jokowi, they do have a similar approach to engaging with China as well, how they're both worried about the rise of China, but they're both willing to try to engage and try to find some common ground with China.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions to get through and 4 more minutes left in our time. I think we can do this. So the first is from Ken McCartney, who says, Canada's ties to many of the other countries in the region are bolstered through immigration. My sense is that we haven't attracted many Indonesians to come to Canada. Why is this? And are we doing better in attracting students from Indonesia, albeit maybe the situation's a bit different right now with COVID?
Ken, two reasons, maybe more, but 2 reasons. One is English. Filipinos generally speak it quite well. Indonesians do not, even as a second language. And second of all, and this was just my sense, I could be wrong on this, but I got the sense when I was there, we certainly had active programs to try and attract more Indonesians, including students. Indonesians generally are less comfortable leaving home, even if they are living in, fairly tough economic situations. They aren't as ready to move abroad, especially to Winnipeg or Saskatoon or Prince George, whereas Filipinos live everywhere all across Canada, including the Yukon and the Northern Prairies, Northern Ontario. So it's just, I think, a completely different dynamic.
Yeah, I think John's right. I did this one journal article with Richard Stubbs, who was an expert on the politics of the Asia Pacific, who just retired a few years ago. And it's one of the things that we found is that more Indonesians were coming to Canada to do university degrees, or at least a term abroad. And that really slowed down, and that there were attempts by the Canadian government to try to encourage that, because we did find that those Indonesians who did spend time in Canada, that it seemed to work to improve relations between the 2 countries, because these were often Indonesians who would find work in the Indonesian bureaucracy. But I think John's right in his characterization of how seems like most Indonesians are not really comfortable with that. I can say from my time in Indonesia, I felt like Indonesia was a long way from Canada, and Indonesians felt like Canada really was half a world away.
Thank you. All right, 1 more question to squeeze into our last minute. Oh, sorry, I have to pop into another chat. Brian asks, is the shift toward Islam in Indonesia seen more with the new investment from the Middle East? And if so, how does one counter it?
Well, I think that's tough to counter because on the one hand, I think that Islam in Indonesia is so uniquely experienced. I think that the old designations of Abangan and Santri in Indonesia, they don't really find expression elsewhere, certainly not in the Middle East. And so there is this uniqueness, but then there is also this concern that exists within Indonesian political culture about how they're seen as not authentically Islamic by Middle Easterners and by some of the more conservative groups within Indonesia. And so it's a really difficult line to walk where you have to, challenge some of the more intolerant expressions coming from these radical groups, but to do it in a way that's coming from like Indonesian Islamic organizations like NU that believe in a very tolerant kind of Islam for Indonesia, that they have to do it in a way that doesn't make it seem as if they're somehow less Islamic than if they were to support the more conservative type of expressions. And so I do think that trying to address it is it's a very big challenge. There's no easy answers. I think it's maybe we're in the beginning of a generational struggle that might be at play.
And just very quickly to add one facet that we've been looking at for 15, 20 years, but we've never in the West and other countries never got a handle on, and that is the money, the flow of money. And it comes not only from some governments in the Middle East, but also from foundations and from different sources. They're funding not only mosques, there's nothing wrong with funding mosques, but they're funding mosques with more radical imams, with more radical preachers. And the impact was evident in the post-Aceh period after the tsunami, as well as other parts of Indonesia. And we could also see the impact in the Philippines.
Thank you. Well, we're completely out of time, so thanks to everyone for those great questions as well. Sean, I'll turn it over to you to close us out.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. What a wonderful presentation. I feel like it's kind of like drinking from a fire hose with the volume of information. My notebooks, my pen hand is all tired, but I really appreciate the insight both of you have been able to bring to us here in Prince George about Indonesia. I'll give one final plug for CIC Prince George. If you're interested in joining our organization, please sign up through the cic.org. There's a link in the right panel on the chat. And final note, for the few of us who are collecting for a virtual pub beer at 2 o'clock, I'm going to send out Zoom invites. If somebody really wants to be part of that, please fire me an email and I'll get you in the Zoom invite. And we'll see some of you on the flip side in about half an hour. Thank you very much, both of you. It's been very informative.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Questions. Great questions.
Thank you so much for letting me be here. Take care, everyone. All the best.
Thank you. Bye.